Dr. Helen Odame.
Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here at Queen's at Monieson because of a broken promise that I would be here many times before. But that doesn't stop Yolanda and I and her team interacting. We talk regularly, and it shows you a bit of the university divide between southwestern Ontario and eastern Ontario. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that divide in relationship to broadband in this presentation. But I'm glad to see that we can bridge it, we can overcome it, and I can come face to face with all of you and see some people who I just don't even able to read about today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about research that I've been involved with since about 2005. I joined the University of Guelph, coming from the International Agricultural Research System back home. I grew up on a farm just outside of Guelph. And it's probably the only job that I would come back to because it was my home community. And I remember many years ago, as a young farm girl, telling my parents of 6 children, forget it, I'm never going to have anything to do with agriculture. I will never do anything in the rural areas. I'm leaving, I'm out of here. And I did. I left at 17 and went on to work internationally and enjoyed it tremendously. But I ate my words, and I've come back to Guelph. I've come back to my family. My parents are thrilled. They're in their 80s. And they said, we knew it. We knew you couldn't get agriculture out of your bloodstream. So that's my personal connection to this topic. I feel very passionate about agriculture and rural Ontario, what's happening to it, and the fact that we are part of a global system, global context, where these issues are mirrored all over the world. The research that we've looked at for the past 5 years or so has really focused in on what's happening with broadband as it relates to rural southwestern Ontario, or more generally, southern Ontario. It may be strange to some of you that this is an issue for us in southern Ontario. When I speak to colleagues who are in northern Canada, they say, wait a minute, you're in one of the most populated areas of Canada, one of the wealthiest areas. Why do you have a broadband problem? They look at the internet data from Statistics Canada, where we see that 30% of Canadian households today do not have broadband access. That's at speeds of 1.5 megabits per second. So that's a very minimum speed. Many of us who subscribe to our households from urban areas are having speeds around 50 to 100, perhaps even. So we have 30% of our households that don't have any access whatsoever. And access we determine with 3 concepts. One is availability of that access. The second is affordability. And the third is the quality of service. You can relate to quality of service. It's when your internet goes on and off. It's when you live in an area for topographic reasons. The trees are interfering with your signal. Or perhaps you've got other types of interference with that quality of service. And the research, as I said, is really focused on how can we have a stronger rural broadband backbone in Ontario. How can that benefit the creative economy? The Monieson Centre asks me, and so I'm very excited to be working with them on that question specifically. And those of you who are familiar with IT systems would say, well, why is Helen using the term broadband backbone? Well, in the industry, there's a term referred to as internet backbone, or perhaps architectural, or perhaps preferred network types of approaches to building broadband and internet access. I refer to it more like a spinal column. I refer to it as the backbone that holds up the stomach of all of Ontario who rely on food and agriculture and rural communities to provide healthy, livable environments. So I'm very conscious of this dual term of broadband backbone. Broadband refers to very high-speed transfer of information through information and communication technologies. All sorts of different technologies. It's a very messy area to try to sort out what package of technologies are actually behind your access. We have fiber, wired, wireless. There's potential within high-speed internet access to use data-rich applications. So a couple of years ago, people started talking about smart apps and apps. Everything was app. Well, data-rich applications have been around for a long time. but we're only beginning to realize how important high-speed internet is for doing things like interacting in video conferencing, peer-to-peer file interaction, sharing of entire data sets, databases, and voice communication. So this will raise an issue within the broadband debate around speed. So speed is an issue for the quality of service here in Canada. We are often told in the media that we pay some of the highest prices for the slowest speeds. Many people who work in telecoms don't want to talk about that. Many people who work at the federal, maybe even provincial, municipal levels don't want to talk about that. But it is a reality of our existence here in Canada, unlike other Western nations around the world. But we also have a very good offering of service in Canada. The problem is the cost associated with that, or even the physical constraints on being able to access that. Broadband is important not just because of the physical technology itself, but because it allows something to happen that is absolutely integral, I believe, to the creative economy. It enables a sharing of codified knowledge. This is documented knowledge. This is knowledge that's written down. This is knowledge that is fluent and on paper, if you want to use that notion. But it also is digital knowledge, digital information and communication that's tacit. It means that it's up here in your head. It's not yet written down. And many of us don't realize that we're constantly working with tacit knowledge systems when we use things like cell phones, because that's an oral expression of knowledge. And so when we look at broadband, we're not just looking at systems that will build codified knowledge documentation, but also social networking and tacit knowledge expression. In the presentation today, I'm going to highlight three key issues. One of them is what's happening across Ontario. I'll use some of our geographic information systems, GIS, maps to demonstrate some of these unprecedented changes happening across southern Ontario. I'll use those maps as well to talk about a little bit about the difference between what's happening southwest of the GTA versus over here in eastern Ontario. I'll look at some of the important economic contributions to date of food and agriculture to our provincial economy, how those relate to the creative economy, and the new economic opportunities that can be realized by a rural broadband backbone. I think the paper that I've distributed to this meeting is much more useful, and I'm sorry that we can't have interactive maps in front of us on laptops so that we can zoom in and zoom out. But what I will show you here are the generalized maps from the Geographic Information Systems mapping. I will use them, first of all, to talk about what's happening here in Ontario. In Ontario, we're realizing tremendous population increases. So relative to the rest of Canada, this is an area of the country where we expect a 12% increase in population between the years of 2006 to 16, and it'll be a 30% population increase by 2031. We also can have perhaps a closer look at this demographic shift by looking at what's happening to our economically active population. So on the map in front of you, what you see is a mapping of the census subdivision age dependency ratio. The age dependency ratio basically maps young people very young people who are not working, with age cohorts who are younger and economically active, all the way up to those seniors, older people who are no longer economically active. So it takes off the two polar ends of our age spectrum. And this map actually shows you what's happening across the province in terms of the distribution of this age dependency ratio. The lighter areas essentially are areas of high economically active population groups. So it's not just a young-old issue. It's a polar ends with this middle group in between. And you can see that across rural southern Ontario, that we have some concerns around the age dependency ratio in some counties and municipalities where we are seeing less economically active population. And they are dependent on the smaller economically active population. So it is this age dependency ratio that's more important than just simply population increase across southern Ontario. As well within this context, and we saw some data in an earlier presentation that sort of alluded to this, and it was dated 2006, so I assume it's from the same data set of census data, that tells us that there is an overall decline in the number of small and medium-sized farms across southern Ontario. The percentage is about 4.2% between 2001 and 2006. So we need to take that into account. The number of small family farms, the one I grew up on, is certainly declining, and that's going to decline further into the future. But what's interesting is because of this population growth rate across Ontario, our rural populations will actually grow. So that's an important point to keep in mind. There's more information in the paper about these demographic shifts. What is apparent too from the work that we're doing, and this is broader information that we have available from OMAFRA and other agencies, is that while it's very fashionable, especially in urban context, to talk about the death of the family farm and the decline of farms across Ontario, and I'm always saying, wait a minute, it's a decline of small and medium-sized farms. It's not the large farms that are declining here. It is fashionable to talk about this, but at the same time, you need to temper this with the fact that you have a very vibrant and still economically important agricultural and food processing sector that accounts for sales of around $33 billion and about 11% of our employment being dependent on that across the province. We also recognize that while the number and the size of farms are under threat, that at the same time, the commodities even being produced from small and medium-sized farms that come from dairy, floriculture, vegetables, hogs, poultry, etc., are very important to the coffers of the province, about 8.86 billion. So keep in mind that this is still a very economically important sector of our economy, agriculture and natural resources. Southern Ontario is facing a rather interesting situation in terms of broadband access. What I've learned over the last 5 years in relationship to data sets, I would like to write up in a book one day. It's about the fact that knowledge is power, about the fact that people don't share data, and that even when we're willing to share data, that there's all sorts of claims associated with that data being too sensitive to release, or perhaps prejudicing or privileging the inclusion or the exclusion of another entity. And I would like to say it's very frustrating as a researcher to work within this data greedy but data unsharing world. One of the challenges that we've done or worked with is that we have census data up until 2006. Fair enough, we can generate maps with this data. But the interesting thing is that this data set needs to be compared with what's really on the ground, because the scale of consolidated census subdivisions is not fine enough to really understand who has internet access and who does not. So what we've done is we've generated maps that are able to compare these different data sets. And here on this map we have coverage in 2005 according to ministry or provincial level data that then has been updated with the hex maps available on the OMAFRA website and cross-checked with census data from StatsCan. And what we can see, and again, this is generalized at a level where the map itself is not a very pretty picture, but if we zoom into specific areas, what we can see is something called a gap effect. In other words, it looks like there is service based on the criteria that OMAFRA and Industry Canada and others use. But on the ground, people will complain there is no service. And this gap effect is occurring across southern Ontario, but it is much stronger and I believe much more serious in certain areas of the province where there are a lot of excuses around the fact that, oh no, we have some service here, and then local people saying, no, I can't actually access this service. It's not available, it's unaffordable, or the quality of the service is very poor. So one of the efforts that we're working on now is to really ground truth these data sets, to integrate it into the geographic information systems that we're using, and to be able to create a more accurate picture of what's happening across southern Ontario. another foray into the whole area